Good morning, everyone, based in Korea, and good evening, based in the United States. And also, welcome to the birth event of the CS, uh, s- uh, the CAU, CCMS, the Cinema and Media Studies Curriculum. So we are ready to, have as the first speaker of our, the curriculum event for this semester, the Dr. Tom Gunning. I believe that the virtually all of you, know who he is. So I'm gonna, introduce, him as briefly as possible, so that, we'll, hear his opening remark or greetings. Then we'll play the video of his pre-recorded talk. Dr. Groening is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Cinema and Media at the University of Chicago. He's the author of D.W. Griffiths and the Origins of American Narrative Film, published by University of Illinois Press in 1986, and the films of Zhang, Allegories of Vision and Modernity, by British Film Institute in 2000, and about 200, articles on film history, film theory, the avant-garde cinema, and the technological modernity and the importance of cinema in our the experience of the vision and the moving image. In 2009, he was awarded the Andrew A. Mellon Distinguished Achievement Award, and in 2010 was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So this year, as many of you know, he published his latest book, The Attraction of the Moving Image, by the University of Chicago Press, and it includes 26, essays, including a few essays that were previously unpublished. But so Tom and I discuss each other about the best topic of our talk, and we agreed that because he will give his talk for the first time to Korean scholars and audiences. Also, the theme attraction or the cinema of attraction that he coined that was still influential has been still influential is the best topic for our curriculum events. We'll see his recorded video, but please welcome Tom for his brief introduction and opening remark.
Well, to speak very briefly before you roll the recorded talk that I did a couple weeks ago, and which has now been supplied with Korean intertitles, as I understand. I want to indicate how thrilled I am to be able to do this, to talk to a nation which has been so important historically, but also particularly in the last couple decades in cinema, and which has become part of international film culture in a very exciting way, and in a way that I've found very exciting, as have many of my countrymen and people around the world. So I very much welcome even more to be able to speak to scholars and film fans and a variety of people, what we call, using the French term, cinéastes, and which I see myself as one, and so we're in fellowship here, and I will now stop talking to you live and let you hear me talk recorded, and then after the talk, which I think is around 15 minutes, I will be back, and we will have a discussion both with Ji-Hoon and with hopefully members of the audience. So thank you all very much for this opportunity, and thank you particularly, June.
Thank you. So we'll start playing the video without further ado. 예, 재생해 주시면 됩니다.
Hello, I'm delighted to be here through an electronic media and through recording, but to be communicating particularly with this exciting new cinematic country. It's not new, of course, in many ways, but it has recently, Korea, become important internationally and become very influential. And so I'm delighted to be addressing you about my concept, the cinema of attractions. And my work is probably best known for introducing the term attractions to film study. This term is both simple and complex. It is both theoretical and historical, and it has acquired its own history now. In this talk, I will lay out what I mean by the term, how it developed, and how I believe it's still relevant to our field of film and media study. So what does attraction mean? Beyond its medical and scientific meanings, which there are several, the Oxford English Dictionary, the OED, defines attraction this way: the action or power of evoking a person's interest, admiration, affection, or sympathy. And I would define an attraction succinctly as, quote, something which seizes one's attention, unquote. In English, the term has for centuries been associated with forms of entertainment, and the OED adds this entry, quote, a place or entertainment that attracts visitors by providing something of interest or pleasure, especially fairground attraction, local attraction, tourist attraction. The word has been long associated with films, and even today, the previews of films coming to a theater in the U.S. are described as previews of coming attractions. Now, from the 19th century on, attractions formed the basis of popular entertainments. Carnivals, fairgrounds, amusement parks all featured attractions. At the end of the 19th century, film appeared and made their earliest appearances in music halls and vaudeville programs as one attraction among many, and films appeared alongside such things as animal acts and dancing girls. While at the fairground, films found a place among other mechanical amusements, such as roller coasters or carousels or Ferris wheels. Now, Soviet director Sergei Eisenstein thought about this context for attractions when in 1923, as a young theater director in the newly established Soviet Union, he wrote his essay, The Montage of Attractions, which you see here. I'm sorry about that thumb, which is rather dirty. It wasn't mine. It's something I found online. But this is, of course, the beginning of his essay. Now, Eisenstein's essay inspired my own use of the word attraction. Eisenstein wrote the essay as part of his all-out assault on bourgeois realistic theater. So, instead of traditional acting, developing characters and taking place within realistic stage sets, Eisenstein staged Ostrovsky's classic Russian comedy, Enough Simplicity for Every Wise Man, as a political circus, dissolving actions into a series of what he called attractions. And this is an image of the young Eisenstein in front of the poster for his production. It was actually a film that was introduced the theatrical program itself. Not only did he translate a classical play into this dramatic kind of circus, he defined attractions as the element that would hold this production together. And he defined the attraction as, and this is quoting Eisenstein, any aggressive aspect of theater which subjects the spectator to a sensual or psychological impact, unquote. Now, for a scene in the play, for instance, where a character considered different course of actions that he might take, Eisenstein staged this decision as a circus attraction and had his actor balance on a tightrope. And you see that there on the left part of the screen. Not only did this translate an interior mental process into an exterior physical action, but the actor, suspended over the audience, provided a direct physical effect as spectators beneath him wondered if he might fall into their laps. The quality of shock, a direct physical, emotional impact on the spectator, defined the power of attractions for Eisenstein. The popular entertainment of the carnival, therefore, provided Eisenstein with a means of revolutionizing theater, creating a different sort of spectator than one who was immersed into a realistic drama. It was this dual approach that inspired my own adoption of the term. On the one hand, the revolutionary modernity of the avant-garde, combined with the immediate physical and emotional impact of the popular arts. So my second section here, attractions in early cinema history. Now, as a young graduate student, I became immersed in researching early cinema. In 1978, my mentor, Eileen Bowser, who you see here, who was the curator of film at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, asked me to participate in a project of FIAF, the International Federation of Film Archives, which was to reevaluate the era of early cinema. It was a project which became known as the Brighton Project. A small group of film scholars viewed all the existing prints of films made before 1907 and that were held in FIAF archives. Now, this amounted to hundreds of films, most of them quite short, which we viewed first at the Museum of Modern Art and later during a week of day-long screenings in a film theater in Brighton, England. In these marathon screenings, I met my friend and colleague, Andre Gaudreau. And you see him here. Well, actually, you see a group of the young members of this project in Brighton in front of a restaurant there. And there I am on the left, back when I still had black hair. And in the middle, looking over people's shoulders, is Andre Gaudreau. Chris Horak is on the right, and John Gartenberg, both of them film curators, are on either sides of Andre, and his girlfriend is there in the front. Andre and I determined after these screenings, we wanted to rethink together what early cinema might mean to film studies. Now, at that time, the dominant historical accounts of this early period of film saw it as a primitive beginning of a progressive development, as an early stage in the process of film achieving its main purpose, which was considered to be storytelling. Film theorist Christian Metz had claimed that the perfecting of narrative form constituted what he called the royal road of cinema, its dominant impulse. This progress was first of all technical, so that film moved from silent films to sound films, from black and white to color, from an almost square ratio to a wide screen. Stylistically, according to this account, narrative forms progressed to more complex stories from primitive short films by introducing psychological characters derived from literature and theater and developing artistic styles. In other words, by emulating the existing arts. Now, although in some ways this version of film history makes sense, my own reading, particularly of the theorist Walter Benjamin and other critics, made me suspicious of describing the history of the arts in terms of progress. I had already begun my research into the early films of D.W. Griffith, and viewing those films made me see cinema's embrace of narrative form as a more complex process. So seeing then hundreds of films made before Griffith, before 1907, for the Brighton Project, made this dominant account of film as a progressive mastery of the means of telling stories seem nearly irrelevant, even if we excluded non-fictional actualities, the short non-fictional films, which actually made up the majority of the films that were made before 1907. Story films, which created psychological and detailed actions in a causal progression, actually made up a rather small proportion of the films that we screened at Brighton. The traditional explanation for this lack described early cinema as a primitive stage, limited in its ability, like the childhood of a human being. Films, this view claimed, had not yet learned to tell stories. But the trick films, the comic gags, the films of landscapes, made before 1907, which we watched for the Brighton Project, were in fact fully understandable and very often delightful. They didn't strike me as a primitive form groping awkwardly towards narrative perfection. Rather, these films seem to attract attention through other visual means than storytelling. Like the circus or the fairground, they entertain viewers with surprises, moments of beauty, or sudden shock. Rather than a period of primitive and undeveloped stories of interest only historically, these early films, I found, were successful on their own terms and still fascinating. They formed a cinema of attractions. The cinema of attractions used a different address to its audience than that which conventional narrative film later developed. And here are its major qualities. First, its temporality, its use of time, which I described as now you see it, now you don't. Attractions tend to be brief, to deliver their effect and then end, rather than develop a story which would take time to unfold. Narrative form depends on the structuring of time. Attractions, in contrast, rely on a brief explosion of surprise. Of course, an attraction can be stretched out a bit in time, like a tightrope walker feat of balancing. Or a showman can create a program with a succession of attractions, one after another, like Méliès's magician, presenting a number of transformations. But attractions do not need the same interweaving of time, action, and motivation that constitutes the narrative art. Attractions are about suddenly rather than then or meanwhile. An attraction is self-contained and complete. Second aspect, acknowledgement of an audience. The attraction is arranged for the viewer, and the viewer is often directly addressed. She is part of the spectacle, and her presence is acknowledged, not at all concealed. Performers often look at or even gesture towards the viewer as if they were present. Christian Metz described the viewer of classical fiction films as voyeuristic. The fiction film, he observed, is presented for the viewer, but their presence is veiled as if they were a concealed voyeur, feasting upon the spectacle while remaining unobserved outside the action. In a classical narrative film, actors are directed not to look directly at the viewer, that is to say, at the camera. This is the opposite of the address of an attraction, which acknowledges the viewer's presence by actors' performances and even the composition of the image. Rather than voyeuristic, as Metz has described the classical film staging, I describe the scenography of attractions as exhibitionistic. Third aspect, cinema itself was an attraction. For the first cinematic exhibitions, the first showings of films from 1895 or 96 on, motion pictures were presented as a scientific and visual novelty, and therefore formed an attraction in themselves. People in this early novelty period did not go to a theater to see a movie, but to see the wonder of motion pictures demonstrated. Far from an invisible means of presenting a story, early cinema featured the latest technical wonder. People came to see the cinematograph, the vitascope, or the biograph, which were names of early cinema machines, and they were announced, these names, rather than a movie title, let alone a story. Further, visual aspects of the new technology were featured. The enlargement of a face, which was not yet considered a close-up, the panning of a camera, or even the colors which in this period were applied to the film itself. Such technical aspects of early film attracted and delighted audiences. Likewise, the cinema's unique ability to offer views of distant lands, such as the image here on the right, which was filmed by a Lumiere cameraman in Indochina, that is to say, Vietnam, or recent newsworthy events, such as here on the left bottom, Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee procession shortly before she died, or sporting events. All of these were attractions that film could make available. So, in summary, attractions in cinema relate directly to the audience's attention and emphasize their viewing and interest in the film, rather than creating a fictional world of storytelling. What French film theory calls the diegesis in which, in that fictional world, they could lose themselves. An attraction is punctual in its temporality and emphatic in its presentation. It served as the dominant impulse behind filmmaking from its beginnings, when the very phenomenon of moving pictures formed an attraction for audiences. For most of cinema's first decade, the cinematic apparatus served to present various attractions to the audience, usually in a program that included a succession of them. Now, my third section about the interaction of attractions and narrative. Attractions have different forms and methods of presentation, as I've just indicated, than storytelling. But in the history of cinema, these two modes are by no means mutually exclusive. To understand how these two different modes interrelate, both in film history and even within a single film, I rely upon the concept of the dominant as developed by the Russian formalist critics in the 1920s. According to linguist Roman Jakobson, who was part of the formalist group, the dominant may be defined as the focusing component of a work of art. It rules, determines, and transforms the remaining components. The dominant guarantees the integrity of the structure. But I must stress that the formalists viewed artistic works as dynamic, made up of the interaction of divergent components and energies, which are often competing and which change over time. The dominant strives to keep this complex work unified, highlighting some aspects while making others subordinate. The dominant, therefore, actively shapes a work of art, and different dominants define the different genres. Poetry, for instance, has a different dominant rhythm, rhyme, alliteration than does, say, the novel, which has characters, suspense, action. Likewise, fiction has a different dominant than an essay. The dominant shifts during different historical periods. 17th century English literature was dominated by poetry, while the novel dominated late 19th century English literature. The dominant even can vary in different parts of a work of art. For instance, in the great American novel, Moby Dick, in some chapters, the dominant is dramatic action taking place between characters, whereas in other chapters, which focus on descriptions of the process of whaling, the dominant would be descriptive and even documentary. I've claimed the dominant of early film history is the attraction, but we would certainly find films during this period where attractions and storytelling compete for dominance, and therefore the dominant varies. And its dynamic interaction is fascinating to trace. The films of the French magician, Georges Méliès, in the early part of the century provide clear examples. Certain of his magic films rely purely on attractions, as the films present a series of magical transformations achieved by cinema tricks. But part of Méliès's great success lay in the fact that a number of his films, a rather small number but important, presented magical transformations within a developing story. For instance, the famous A Trip to the Moon, which you see there on the right, tells the story of a group of scientists traveling to the moon and back. We see successively their planning of the voyage, the building of the rocket ship, launching it, arriving on the moon, encountering its inhabitants, who are the Selenites, as they're called, then returning to Earth, where the voyage is celebrated. Presenting a story in cinema in 1902, when the film was made, was a novelty in itself and certainly attracted and pleased an audience. But viewers' delight in following the story was certainly matched, and I would claim exceeded, by the various attractions encountered on the way. Most obviously, the magical effects of the moon voyage, the vision of the rocket ship traveling through space and landing on the moon, the explosion of the moon's inhabitants, the Selenite, when they're attacked by the invaders from Earth, and the appearance of celestial bodies in the sky. See there on the upper left. Among these cinematic attractions, we should mention Méliès's wonderfully designed sets and the costumes that he designed for the Selenites, or the line of shapely young women who load the rocket into the launcher, and in many prints, the bright colors which were applied to the film. Méliès himself described the relation between his attractions and the narrative that carried them. He stated, quote, "As for the scenario, the fable or tale, I only consider it at the end. I can state that the scenario constructed in this manner has no importance, since I use it merely as a pretext, as for the stage effects, the tricks, or a nicely arranged tableau, unquote. In Méliès's cinema of attractions, the story comes last, and is only a pretext for the attractions, or as he described it in one place, the story created a clothesline on which he hung his visual attractions and effects. Therefore, let me state it again, attractions and storytelling are different, but they're not contradictory. Indeed, they can coexist and even aid each other. But which one dominates the film varies according to historical period or film genre. I've claimed that film's stylistics, until about 1907, are dominated by attractions. After that date, storytelling or narrative becomes increasingly important. The films dominated by attractions became one component of the program of films that were shown during the Nickelodeon or Fairground cinema period, a period which lasted roughly from about 1905 to 1913 in Europe and the Americas. Trick films and scenics, which were views of foreign lands and landscapes, genres which were still dominated by visual attractions, became one part of the film program in this later era, while story films became more popular and were often featured in the programs. Many story films resembled Méliès's films and were dominated by a succession of comic gags or actions, such as the chase film, which became popular beginning around 1904, or slapstick comedy. Such films teeter between highlighting attractions or emphasizing the development of storylines and characters. Film historian Don Crafton quite brilliantly described this as a conflict between what he called the pie and the chase. The pie was an attraction, so named by Crafton after the slapstick action of throwing pies at a character and then enjoying their surprise and the spectacle of the mess that the pie causes. On the other hand, the chase, in which a character is pursued by other characters, inaugurated some of the earliest narrative films. Those images in the middle there are from various versions of Personal, a 1904 film in which a man is pursued by women who want to marry him. These inaugurated some of the earliest narrative films, as the action created a clear temporal and spatial progression. Characters moved through a successive group of locales, and the chase reached a resolution when the pursuers caught the pursued. Now, I've termed this later period, when story films began to dominate the film programs, as the cinema of narrative integration. In the US and Europe, it lasted from about 1907 to the beginnings of the feature film around 1914. Storytelling became the dominant, the aspect of the film that integrated other aspects, including attractions, and subordinated them to the main purpose of telling a story. Besides the coherence of a temporally unified action with a beginning, middle, and end, that is, an action that develops and becomes resolved, a major aspect of this new form was the importance of characters. At first, characters performed a simple action, the chaser and the chased, for instance. But increasingly, actors indicated the purposes and motivations behind their actions, following models of other forms of storytelling, character motivation became more psychological rather than simply physical. Developing ways to convey character psychological motivation formed an aspect of cinema style, not only through acting and plot construction, but through filmic techniques such as the close-up and new patterns of editing. My term, narrative integration, was partly inspired by an insight the film historian Ben Brewster once gave me, pointing out that narrative in film primarily integrated other elements. The cinema of narrative integration, whose development I analyzed in detail in my book on D.W. Griffith's films, D.W. Griffith and the Origins of American Narrative Film, the Early Years of Biograph. These early films of Griffith introduced structures of character psychology and narrative suspense and made moral judgments on the characters. But attractions such as camera tricks, beautiful landscapes, or the cinematic effects such as a close-up did not disappear. Rather, they became integrated into the story, serving new narrative purposes of creating mood and directing attention to details of the story. A close-up no longer simply offered a visual attraction, but gave an indication of character emotion. A landscape no longer simply displayed picturesque qualities, but became a stage for action. Attractions were absorbed into the dominant task of telling a story. But crucially, such devices did not lose their quality as attraction. Cinema, even as a storytelling medium, remains dependent on visual attractions. Attractions can have multiple effects, both telling a story and being visually compelling. Therefore, the cinema of attractions, while describing an early period of the history of film style, does not only describe this supposedly primitive period, rather it isolates an essential aspect of nearly all cinema, which does not necessarily undermine narrative roles. But the importance of attraction should make us question any assertion that story is the most important aspect of every film, the one on which a film's quality and value depends. A good example of the interweaving of attraction and narrative appears in film history after the historical era of the cinema attraction, and this is the star. Stars in cinema only emerged during the era of narrative integration, when audiences learned to love actors largely through the characters they played in story films. Screen personalities such as Lillian Gish, Mary Pickford, Charlie Chaplin, or Rudolph Valentino, which we see here, and other actors, became recognized by filmgoers. Then, after this recognition, they were given credits by film producers, along with increased salaries. This was followed by a strategy of publicity, which made the names and faces of stars a principal selling point for films. Now, the close-up undoubtedly contributed to this popularity, making visible not only the star's acting talent, but their physical beauty, and the quality which French critics of the 20s termed photogénie, which was basically the ability to look good in a film. It is, I think, unquestionable that the film star forms an attraction, one of the elements that draws us to movies. I think it would oversimplify things if we view attractions only in terms of their contribution to telling a story, as important as that might be. My claim that films have different dominance in different parts of a film should be kept in mind.
a key genre of the commercial film, the musical, shows the attraction may still dominate, while narrative plays a role closer to that which Melly has described as a clothesline from which holds the attractions, in this case, singing and dancing numbers, together. Of course, there are many fine musicals in which the narrative is very important, and the songs support the development of character and situation. For instance, films like George Cukor's A Star is Born from 1958, or Vincent Minnelli's, and this is on the right there on the bottom, Meet Me in St. Louis, where songs songs develop essential narrative scenes such as romances or moments of a character's reflection. However, even in these films, the musical numbers are filmed as attractions, that is, with a direct address to the viewer in framing and performance, a certain self-contained structure, and a strong sense of visual spectacle in costume, set, and staging. See this particularly on the left with a shot from Minnelli's The Bandwagon, where we really see this direct address of an attraction. One experiences these scenes as an interruption, often different from the flow of action, even if they are embedded in a narrative. Many films owe their impact to such attractions, whether carefully integrated or abruptly inserted into the larger plot. These moments of display, or bits of business, as Hollywood professionals often referred to them, can provide a film's principal source of enjoyment. Think, for instance, of the moments in horror films in which the climax of the action seems excessive, and to leap off the screen, directly confronting the audience, even sometimes eliciting screams, as if the viewer were actually in danger. Further, as has often been pointed out in response to my original essay, the emphasis on special effects in recent cinema could be seen as a kind of return of the cinema of attractions. The technical achievements of digital cinema has rendered scenes of seemingly impossible events vivid and provokes viewer astonishment, whether of dinosaurs resurrected, giant robots invading cities, people flying mythical creatures, or even physical stunts. Indeed, the performances, such as Tom Cruise in the recent Mission Impossible installment, Final Reckoning, demonstrates that cinema's continued ability to capture physical stunts as opposed to digital creations remains an attraction. In either case, cinema's ability to display and present an attraction to an audience dominates the screen and the viewer's attention, just as it did in the era of Douglas Fairbanks there on the left, or such forgotten European stars as Eddie Polo. My fourth section here, expanded attractions. The cinema has always served as an attraction, and this includes not only its ability to present stars, physical actions, or sets, but its technical mode of presentation. 3D, which as a device has come and gone in different periods of film history, has employed a variety of technical devices to achieve the appearance of three dimensions on the screen, and it remains one of the clearest examples of the survival of the cinema of attractions. Indeed, its revival a few decades ago sparked the enmity of narratively focused film critics such as the American reviewer Roger Ebert, who wrote a scathing article entitled "Why I Hate 3D, and You Should Too," which largely argued that 3D was bad because it added nothing to the story. Widescreen, 3D, and IMAX show the essential tie between attraction and cinematic exhibition modes. Now, while all these devices, whether technical or stylistic, are tied to the popularity of commercial cinema, I would emphasize that this does not mean attractions are the domain exclusively of the box office. First of all, there are the non-narrative, or at least non-fictional genres, which are marginalized in most accounts of cinema, whether historical or theoretical. These would include travelogues, newsreels, and cartoons, which may have narrative elements, but remain more closely related to attraction modes of direct address, which is often indicated by voice-over narration in the sound era. In the classical era of film programs, basically from about 1917 to around 1960, these genres were relegated to the opening of programs in support of the feature fictional film, and were often referred to as added attractions. Then there are non-commercial genres, which address the viewer with little attempt at creating a diegesis, such as the educational film, the home movie, or even the pornographic film. Such films are usually characterized by different exhibition modes and contexts: the classroom, the home living room, or a private screening, and have been greatly revolutionized by new, more private modes of screen viewing on personal screens. People interact more actively with these forms, taking notes, say, or calling out family names and greetings, or even masturbating. These are all important aspects of cinema culture that are largely excluded from scholarly concerns until recently. Therefore, the omnipresence and accessibility of new platforms for moving images have both allowed and encouraged the proliferation of makers and viewers of such forms. It seems to me that attractions are the dominant mode of this new moving image culture. The content created for YouTube and TikTok seems to use an attractional mode, employing a direct address to the viewer and interested more in sparking interest and attracting attention than in creating fictional worlds or telling new stories. Again, to separate attractions and narrative totally in this new mode may be not only impossible, but misguided. Yet approaching these new means of exhibition through the lens of attractions seems to me most fruitful. Now, to pick up on Eisenstein's use of attractions in avant-garde theater, avant-garde or experimental cinema can also be related to the aesthetic of attractions. Just as Eisenstein felt that the attractions of the popular arts, such as the circus or music hall, offered new forms to the avant-garde artists who were attempting to free themselves from traditional bourgeois traditions, the avant-garde cinema of the 1920s, created by innovative filmmakers in the Soviet Union and France, sought different paths than the imitation of theater that they believed the commercial cinema had adopted. At points, experimental filmmakers actually looked back to the early cinema for their models. As I've mentioned, it was partly the films made by the avant-garde filmmakers in the 1970s, such as Ken Jacobs, whose Tom, the Pirate Son, is up there on the left, Hollis Frampton, or Malcolm LaGrice's use of footage from early films that led me to an appreciation of the radical possibilities of early film attractions. Avant-garde cinema is primarily a non-narrative mode, and therefore creating a diegesis or psychological characters does not play a major role. Further, the creation of a coherent dramatic space or temporality or sense of time, which formed the royal road of narrative film development, was either ignored or reconceived by these filmmakers. But perhaps most essentially, the avant-garde saw the motion picture as a way to discover new modes of perception, a new way of interacting with modern technology, and we might claim to inhabit a modern world. While high modernism may be viewed sometimes as a defense against this new technological culture, the avant-garde, at least in some respects, tried to retool technology and discover new possibilities within it. This could include embracing mass culture, or at least aspects of it. However, as varied as attractions can be, and the large variety of contexts and purposes in which it can appear, I resist using the term for every visual aspect that doesn't serve to tell stories, or the concept might lose clarity and definition. But I hope that by opening the analysis of moving images beyond the demands of storytelling, we can discover new modes of analysis and refine and define new terms of differentiation. And a few questions for further discussion now occur to me. Influenced undoubtedly by Eisenstein's essay and the writings of Walter Benjamin, in my first essays, I related the attractions of early cinema to shock and suddenness. I believe this made sense for the era of early cinema, but I now wonder about other modes of visual address, not narrative in their intent, but less abrupt perhaps, and sudden, such as certain views of landscape or natural phenomenon. A more contemplative view, allowing a slower and perhaps more extended time of visual contemplation, would seem to offer another possible cinematic way of viewing. This might correspond to the lyrical mode of film, which the Russian formalists described in the 1920s, and which could be found in many films, ranging from the lyrical sequences in silent Soviet films, such as the undulating wheat fields blowing in the wind in Alexei Dovzhenko's 1930 film Earth, or the scenes of nature in Jean Renoir's Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, up there on the upper right, or many images in the films of Terrence Malick, over on the left. Experimental filmmaker Maya Deren, in her famous discussion of poetry in film, included sequences of description that occur in the opening of certain narrative films or documentary genres such as city symphonies, and claimed they might be included in the category of poetry and film. Whether to call such sequences as attractions or give them another rubric is an open question for me. Many avant-garde films might best fit into this category, perhaps best called lyrical or poetic. So I hope the concept of attractions offers a study of media several things. It breaks, first of all, the hegemony of narrative as the royal road of moving picture development, both in the sense of historical progress, from primitivism to a kind of sophistication, and any claim that the value of a film necessarily lies primarily in its story. Historical periods or specific genres which are not dominated by narrative need not be relegated to the primitive, childish, or simplistic. Work should be viewed as dynamic and complex wholes in which non-narrative attractions can either maintain their unique mode of address or can be integrated more or less smoothly into a narrative. And perhaps most essentially, the pure visual pleasure of the moving image should be valued without having to be assimilated to the tasks of developing action, creating character, or fashioning a fictional world. Thank you for listening, and I hope this all makes sense, and I look forward to the discussion that will follow.
All right. So thank you, Tom, for your fascinating and comprehensive talk on the origins and development of the concept of the cinema of attractions and its expanded applications, and for the research topic in terms of how the concept can be further used for further inquiry into the mystery and powers of cinema that we all share it with each other. So my question is just one, but it is followed by my summary of the book's first and second part, particularly the second part. I love the way that Daniel Morgan, who edits edited the attractions of the moving image, positions you not just as film historian but also as film theorist. This is what you underscored in the introduction of this talk, that is attraction as a concept that is theoretical and historical simultaneously. It is also evident in an aesthetics of astonishment essay, or sequel to the attraction essay, that is also included in the book's first part, in which you revisit cinema's founding myths of the first spectators who was frightened at the spectacle of the train, to provide a more nuanced understanding of cinema's motion and illusion, and the film spectatorship that negotiates between deception and the suspension of disbelief. I also see this rich intersection of history and theory in the moving away from the index essay included in the book part 2, entitled Theory. In this work, you also reread André Bazin, Siegfried Kracauer, and most importantly, Christian Metz, in order to argue that the assertion of indexicality as a semiotic concept as essential to cinema is not sufficient to exploring cinema's phenomenological richness, including its impression of reality given to spectators as presence. In this context, this essay, I think, offers a precious opportunity to understand both film theory and film history in ways that go beyond the simplified binaries of film and animation and film and the digital. So in this regard, I was wondering how you see the growing impact of the artificial intelligence, or particularly generative AI, on the cinema as you have known it. Your theoretical works included in the book's part 2, as well as what's the point of the index essay, which is not included in the book, suggests that digital technology does not make a total departure or break from photographic media as it seems, including its manipulative capacity. This is also suggested in the talk, expanded attraction sections, where you raise the examples of contemporary data effect-driven cinema and a plurality of short videos on TikTok that present visceral, the direct address spectacles in the sheer exhibitionist manner. The impact of the generative AI on cinema, in a sense, seems to fit into these examples. OpenAI Sora, Google's Bio, etc., seems to rehabilitate the magical tradition of the early cinema by foregrounding their technological capacity, therefore illustrating their own exhibitionism or magical capacity. However, Gen AI models also generate motion in completely different ways, and the images that it generates are perceived as photographic or cinematic without the camera's encounter with reality and its registration or contingency. So there are kinds of a series of similarities or departures, or the distinction between between cinema, the celluloid-based cinema and the AI-based moving image, even the previous digital cinema and the synthesized moving image based on AI. So I was wondering how you see the recent technological development driven by the adoption of AI to cinema in terms of your view on attraction and how it is continued and rehabilitated in the digital age.
The issue of AI is complicated, but I would have to say that to me, the idea of the attraction is just as relevant to an AI-generated image as to the more traditional images. And I guess what I would point out, a lot of the discussion theoretically and politically of AI, including a fair amount of panic about it, is mainly around issues of realism and the traditional issue of indexicality, that the photographic image was somehow the imprint of reality and therefore evidence of reality. And in the essays that you mentioned, I point out that this is not necessarily that true. That in fact, and to me, immediately, what I would say is, well, not only AI, but what about animation, which is almost as old as cinema, which has no necessary relationship of indexicality or of this very complicated and very hard to define term, realism. Cinema is not necessarily realistic. It doesn't have a responsibility to necessarily be realistic. Obviously, there are genres of cinema, such as documentary or news reporting, which do have indexing, which draw on and particularly work with the indexicality, which can be. I'm not saying it's not an aspect of photography. It can be. I'm just saying it's not necessarily an aspect of cinema itself, at least in the sense of it as an imprint of reality. So what partly I guess I would say most immediately is AI is another attraction. There are obviously issues which to me are not primarily about the issue of attraction that it raises, and which I think are often used as a kind of political panic and used as journalists, the whole world will be destroyed by AI. I now, mind you, I'm not trying to say that there aren't concerns, but I think there are so many concerns right now politically that AI is maybe a minor one of them. The whole issue of what fake news is maybe illustrated by AI, but certainly is not coming from AI. The attraction, absolutely, AI can generate that. And I have seen some very exciting work, particularly in the avant-garde, that use AI to generate images that are new and disturbing or exciting or beautiful. And so I see it as part of very important fact about cinema to me. There's a quote from Andre Bazin, who I admire very greatly, even though I disagree in certain ways. But he ends his essay on the myth of total cinema with a statement which I quote a number of times. cinema has not yet been invented. And what that emphasizes to me is not obviously the kind of paradox of we haven't invented cinema, but that there is no end to the invention of cinema. It is constantly reinventing itself. It is constantly expanding and reworking and appearing in new forms. And that to me, although it certainly can be frustrating and certainly like anything, it can be used for evil purposes as well as benevolent ones. But to me, it's part of the dynamism, and it's why cinema is, to my mind, the art of technology, the art of modernity, and the art of the future. Because the future is never, as philosopher Henri Bergson pointed out to us more than a century ago, we never know what it is. And even predicting it is probably not worthwhile. So I don't, that's we could talk about this all evening,
Yeah.
but that's maybe a quick kind of assembly of some thoughts on that issue.
Thank you. Actually, I definitely agree that the a bunch of avant-garde filmmakers, or even the German veteran SF filmmaker Alexander Kluge has been venturing into AI technology to make a fascinating SF film films with
Yes.
stable diffusion, and so that also leads me to smoothly move into the book's third section that brings together the essays that demonstrate, your sustained engagement with, the avant-garde filmmakers such as Ken Jacobs, Onnie Gale, Abigail Child, Gustav Deutsch, and, Stan Brakhage. Also, I was wondering, how does your choice of this list of filmmakers relate to your view on the history of avant-garde cinema? Or how is the concept of abstraction helpful to rewriting the history of avant-garde cinema?
Yeah, it's a big question because obviously my essays have primarily on the avant-garde have primarily been about films made in the post-World War II era, primarily in the United States, and it's partly because of my own exposure both to those films and occasionally to the filmmakers and conversations that I was able to have with them. At the same time, it's a little bit as though there are two, I don't want to make this absolute, but two periods of avant-garde film. One, the 20s, the period of the Soviet cinema, the period of the French cinema, and also some other international in Germany, the United States, and even in Latin America, and even a bit in Japan and China. And then on the other hand, a period that's more recent, probably primarily from the 50s and 60s up until this day. Now, that isn't to say there was nothing in between, but partly because of the politics. Uh, World War II, the rise of fascism, the rise of Stalinism, both were repressive in certain countries of avant-garde work. And also there was a question of whether certain type of formalistic forms were the best ways to address conditions. And therefore, in that period, what probably is the most interesting kind of theoretical road to follow is Andre Bazin's ideas and Siegfried Kracauer as well of realism, which is something that I'm very interested in, but which primarily is not well represented in any of the essays in that book. Although I think the essays on the index are at least theoretically about the issue of realism. But I'm interested in the variety of ways that the idea of realism can also be approached. So the history of the avant-garde, to go back to your question, I think of as discontinuous, and that, but in many ways, the avant-garde of the 60s, 70s, 80s was partly about rediscovering things from the 20s, not imitating them necessarily, but being somehow inspired and even at points trying to correct them, to think through questions that they raise, but in different manners. Now that issue is something that I've never written on, and in fact, I'm just now kind of thinking about.
All right, so let me open the floor. So right now, to accept your question and comment on the talk and Tom's body of work. And for those of you who wants to raise your comment and question, you turn on your video and say something, or you type your question on the chat box on the right side of your screen. Yeah, I can see it. The Mr. Tang.
Yeah. Hi, Tom.
Hello. I should mention perhaps that Pao Chen was one of my students at Chicago, and I don't want to embarrass him, but a very brilliant student. So I'm very glad to get a chance to talk to him.
Yes, I just wanted to hear, actually, this is not so much a question as maybe an invitation for you to talk more about the final part of the talk when you turn to nature and landscape. The one that really kind of surprised me, right, when you sort of started to associate the attractive with the lyrical or the poetic.
Yeah.
The examples that you selected are indeed the more sort of lyrical ones, sort of slow cinema, for instance. Terrace Malick was one of your cases. And I was also wondering, but even for someone like Eisenstein, right, natural landscape is, incredibly powerful, even though the way he approached nature and landscape is perhaps not as lyrical, right? It's emphasizing perhaps the tension within, whether it's cross shot or even a certain element within a single frame or sound image sort of montage. So really, I just wanted to hear more about how these two modes of address, right, could be sort of be related to each other, and how, in what way could the kind of more lyrical, slower type of nature and landscape be attractive, following your general framework, right, from early cinema to experiment to avant-garde films.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is a question about what is basically, and I kind of tried to emphasize this in the presentation of it this evening, a work in progress where I'm trying to think through expanding the idea of attraction and a little bit expanding it historically, thinking more about more recent films, but also about the films of the 20s. And I agree with you that Eisenstein is relevant here. If we think about, for instance, the sequence in Potemkin of the bringing the body of the sailor into Odessa harbor, and which he talks about as a kind of lyrical sequence, and which definitely we get also in sequences in Old and New, his last silent film. And what I'm still working out a little bit is to what extent this should be something that might be similar to attraction in being non-narrative, but actually should be theorized independently. My tendency, though, is that by bringing it in relation to the idea of attraction, number one, it emphasizes its non-narrative background or impulse, and that it also makes attraction into a more expansive term, which I think is probably a good idea, although, as I indicated, there is also the danger that it becomes too all-embracing. So a little bit, I'm thinking this out myself, but interestingly, and I mentioned this very briefly, in the 1920s, the Russian formalists actually did a series of essays about cinema that's very, very interesting, and it's been translated into English and I don't know what other languages. But they do at one point raise this issue of what they call the lyrical film. And I think it's not been picked up by either film historians or stylistic historians. And I think it's very worthwhile to think about it as an important part of cinema, and particularly that it's interrelation to narrative. So, they give as examples, as I recall, I think certain elements in Griffith films. His there is that amazing quote from Griffith in his later years, talking about how the beauty of early cinema, or of silent cinema, not necessarily the early cinema that I've been talking about, but the period of his filmmaking had this kind of beauty which he described as the beauty of the wind in the trees, the wind blowing the leaves of the trees. And of course, it's something that Krakauer picked up on in his theory of film. And again, kind of shows, because for Krakauer it was a sign of realism, uh, and again, indicates to me how that term itself needs to be, you know, reworked and taken away from its sense of purely being indexical and purely being representational, and it having other elements. So these are things that I'm thinking about, but I'm glad that it was perked your curiosity.
Thank you.
Thank you for your rich, conversation. Listening to, that exchange, I had the idea that of, understanding, the concept of the attractions as, dialectical, or attraction as a dialectical concept. Because, we see, close up as a key example of the cinema with the attractions technique. And Tom's recent interest is how that kind of concept is extended into the poetic or lyrical, images of landscape. And these two kinds of images, are commonly characterized by the dialectics of exhibitionism and concealment, or legibility and illegibility, and concreteness and abstraction. So, that makes the richer avenue for the discussion about the further implications of attraction in more nuanced or dialectical way, applying to the various stylistic traditions of cinema. So, but I can see Ian raising the hand, so you can turn on your video.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks. It's 5 in the morning here in Cape Town, South Africa. So thanks very much. Early start. Tom, that was fantastic. I just had I'm really interested by Pao Chen's comment as well, because I was watching, I've studied Malik and I teach early cinema now. I was interested in the idea that there's a quote by a Japanese film philosopher who, I can't remember who it is. He talks about the cutaway shot being an element that opposes drama. And this idea that in thinking about attractions, you were just mentioning the idea of technique, Ji-hoon, as well, that if we think about ideas such as the long take, a lot of my students are, we're talking a lot about that series Adolescence, that there's an emphasis on the technique itself as being something that is talked about. And that perhaps one of the interesting things about this AI environment, and I'm finding it in a lot of my students, is a kind of move back to a kind of realism. And I'm wondering whether, as part of this kind of what you're doing in your work, is kind of going full circle, bringing back this idea of attractions to what's happening in current media, that we might be in an environment where something like realism and a kind of a sort of excessive realism, if you want to call it that, is itself a kind of attraction. That what pulls us back to the narrative is that you had a lovely phrase earlier where you talked about AI being without the camera's encounter with reality. And I wonder whether that idea of the encounter with reality is itself a kind of attraction.
To give you a quick answer, yes. But it is complicated, partly because of what the term realism means. I, at one point in teaching a class, said, that I had studied this term, gone through what it means in painting, what it means in literature, what it meant in the 19th century, what it means in 20th, what it's going to mean in the 21st, and came to the conclusion that the definition was that realism meant any goddamn thing you wanted it to mean. So that is certainly a problem and to some extent, to my mind, makes the term difficult to use. But it's also a bit like my quote from Bazin about cinema not being invented yet, an indication that it's part of the power of that term, the very fact that it means so many different things to so many different people. Now, I'm resistant, even though I think there are uses of realism as evidence. You know, I mean, was recently writing about the famous Rolling Stones documentary "Give Me Shelter," where there's evidence that got somebody off a murder charge because it showed that he stabbed someone who had already drawn a pistol, and the cinematic thing there was incontrovertible. So I'm not saying that cinema or photography never has an indexical claim for reality, but I am saying that in most cases where people are talking about realism, and particularly Andre Bazin, even though he's not always clear about this, that they're meaning something much more complicated, much more expansive. And that's partly why in my essays on the index, I partly emphasize Christian Metz, who sometimes is my opponent in thinking about narrative film history, but who I respect very much, saying that actually the feeling of realism in a film is more about movement than about an index, which means you can get it in an animated cartoon, which means you can get it in AI. I definitely feel, I mean, it's curious because the long take is a very complicated thing. And partly what hits me is the way that long takes now are exactly as you were saying, almost an attraction in themselves, something calling attention to themselves, not necessarily calling attention to what they're filming, but to the fact that it's being filmed in a particular way, which to me is by definition, or is a part of the definition of an attraction. But then the other issue about a long take is the issue of time. And I think that this issue in terms of film is still amazingly primitively thought of. It's kind of assumed that film somehow has this, it's a temporal medium. This is very, very important, but that somehow that is all we need to say, and that we know what that means is to me nonsense. Actually, the whole issue has to be, what does that mean? And I think it worries me sometimes with long take films that that's enough, that both technically and theoretically, it just seems to be partly saying we're not a Hollywood film because because we're really boring, and we're making you wait, when nothing is happening. That to me is too simplistic. But to really think through the issue of time in film is I think a real challenge, and that new media makes it more complicated, but also more interesting because it gives us more tools.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Let me, briefly, briefly summarize, the two, conversations in Korean for Korean audience, before, accepting the next question, the raised by the Sang-young who is raising her hand. And 첫 번째 질문과 이제 답은 이제 강의 말미에 얘기한 어떤 그 풍경의 시약과 관련된 논의를 바탕으로 해서 말하자면 이제 풍경의 시약에 대한 이 어트랙션 개념이 적용될 그 가능성에 대한 이제 그 모색이 말하자면 아이젠슈타인의 이제 그 어떤 이론, 즉 그 시네마 어트랙션을 뒷받침한 아이젠슈타인 이론과 어떤 식으로 사실은 이제 그 연결이 될 수 있는가에 대한 이제 대화였고, 두 번째는 카메라의 기록이 제 그 질문과 연관이 된 것인데, 카메라의 기록이 말하자면 이제 어트랙션에 사실 본질적이라고 당신이 믿냐 했을 때, 사실 이제 영화의 시간성 등과에 대한 긴 논의가 있었지만 사실 이제 근본적으로 그렇다는 이제 그 말씀하셨습니다. So let me accept a couple more questions, and so I can see Sang-young, so you can go ahead.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful talk. I learned a lot. And as a person who studies experimental cinema, I could really relate to your later question and on avant-garde film. And also, I really enjoyed listening to all this discussion. And I have some related questions. So I felt that your statement was largely based on this premise that a movie normally seeks to draw the viewer into it, whether through attraction or narrative. But maybe I thought we might also can think of a little different modes of cinema or discourses. Like, for example, like films of intentional boredom, or maybe like Jean Ma's recent work on sleeping mode of the spectator, like where filmmakers are okay with or sometimes deliberately induce the audience to fall asleep. So when this degree of boredom goes beyond this threshold of pleasurable contemplation, and it was actually a part of filmmakers' intention, like maybe to the extent of pushing away the audience instead of drawing them into the film, or to the extent of pure illegibility, like how can we think of these kind of films?
Yes. I'm sorry. I
No,
don't
no.
want to interrupt because it's a very interesting question. Um, what I would say is, to some extent, the model that I'm getting, and this can seem oversimplified, but I think it's useful, that a narrative cinema is in the whole idea of a diegesis, is about absorption, and indeed it's the way that that term was kind of developed in art history that I'm particularly interested in. So that is kind of pulling you in. But to my mind, the attraction was about pushing you out, or at least it was pushing out towards you. So that there was this kind of idea of not inviting you in, but rather confronting you. Which is a little different than the way you were describing it. But I do understand how you're drawing up another difference, which is that of resistance from the film. What you're kind of calling boredom, which of course is a pejorative term usually, but I understand that you're not using it in a pejorative sense. Oh, that film was boring, let's turn it off. I am a little bit interested in my work in reviving the idea of film pleasure, which of course was with Laura Mulvey, who was a very big influence on my writing of the original essay, was kind of attacking the idea of film pleasure, visual pleasure, which she saw as partly a structure of dominance. And I kind of am of the opinion that the pleasure that one gets from film is not necessarily that of dominance. It certainly can be and has been, and I think her analysis of the male gaze is widely true. However, I do believe that there are pleasures even, and what I think I would say, and I have a feeling you would maybe not disagree with this, there's maybe even a pleasure in boredom. Or, if we don't want to use pleasure, there's something, maybe we should say an attraction in boredom. I do believe that there is, by using the word attraction, I am trying to indicate that there's something that pulls us to watch the film. Now, it's interesting because I know at one point I heard a theorist who I liked very much, a German theorist, thinking that I was saying by cinema of attraction purely pleasant experiences, which not at all. I mean, if we think particularly of, the attraction in Eisenstein, the smashed glasses, he related it more to things like Grand Guignol, to terror, and I, of course, in my essay, The Aesthetic of Astonishment, emphasized that as well. That it's also a recoil, and of course, my example in this talk of the horror film and the moments of terror. I do want to indicate that there's something that pulls us, but it's not necessarily always pleasant and always pleasurable, even though I do want in some ways to have a kind of defense of the idea of pleasure, but even more maybe curiosity, you know, and although, as I say, I sometimes am a little bit bothered by the long take and the slow movie as almost too simplistic, as though there were films that just kind of saying, we're not Hollywood films, we're not this, we're not that, rather than we are something. My interest is in those films that are considered boring, not to find something that isn't just boring. So my own experience in the films of Ernie Gare and the films of Michael Snow, films of Ken Jacobs, was that these films that were very often considered boring by people, in fact, had myriads, riches that you had to overcome something to discover. So I'm a little bit, you know, reluctant to embrace the idea of boring unless it's boring to get beyond boredom.
예,
Thank you so much.
예, 방금 이제 그 논의는 사실 이제 그 어트랙션, 시네마 어트랙션의 이제 관람성과 관련된 부분이었죠. 그래서 그러니까 말하자면 이제 어트랙션 시네마가 관객한테 호기심을 이제 불러일으키고 말하자면 이제 관객을 끌어당기거나 관객한테 이제 말하자면 다가가는 그런 이제 그 모드인데 과연 그런 것이 실험 영화 그리고 최근에 이제 어떤 무빙 이미지 전통의 작품에서도 이제 활성화되는 말하자면 이제 어떤 지루함 혹은 이제 관조의 모드 어떤 식으로 이제 상호작용할 수 있을까라는 것이었고 관계 맺을 수 있는 것이고 탐정님의 대학은 그 둘을 반드시 이분법적으로만 볼 필요는 없다는 것이었습니다. 예, I can see from the chat box, another question posed by the Min Eugene. So let me read, her question. Thank you so much for your talk. Was deeply inspired by your concept of the cinema of attraction when I first began studying film. My interest has shifted toward the sound of cinema, and I've often wondered how you view the role of sound within that framework, which is pertinent to me, definitely a very important question. Personally, I believe sound can have an equally and sometimes even more direct impact on the audience. Even in the early film exhibition practices, in-house traveling shows included elaborate sound effects performed live by dedicated sound teams. We can also add, the example of Alice Guy-Blache here, her experiment with, the synchronized sound. These effects often drew gasps and excitement from the audience, arguably functioning as a major attraction in themselves. Also, I think contemporary sound technologies in theater, such as Dolby Atmos, have a similar effect. So she was curious if you ever consider how such sonic elements feed into or even expand your concept of the attraction. It's truly an honor to be able to ask you this.
Well, let me say right off that I am in very strong agreement with everything that you say there. And I'm aware that I don't deal with sound that much in my work, not because I don't think it's important or even that I'm not interested in it. I don't quite feel that I have I don't know, partly it's not so much the technical knowledge because I have some of the technical knowledge about the history of sound, and it's very, very interesting, in particular the whole history of acoustics generally. But somehow I don't think I'm as acute a critic of sound as I am of the image, and that's just my own inclination. But it is absolutely true that I think sound is just as much an attraction, or can be just as much an attraction as anything in the image. And absolutely, the technologies of sound are extremely interesting. And I'm very interested in the Atmos and that experience, which again, what we find is so often how would I put it? The discourse about the sound has been kind of restricted to issues of realism, whereas I think there are so many other things to talk about. And that is exactly what I would say would be the importance of thinking about sound in terms of attractions, is to get away from the not to deny absolutely that there's a realistic component to the issue of sound, but to get away from that as the dominant discourse and to really think about what the address is. It interests me very much the way off-screen sound works, of drawing our attention, very much the way the kind of atmospheric sound of things like Atmos work and various other, multi-channel sound. And also the issue that, of course, sound has so often been primarily thought about in terms of the history of film, in terms of dialogue, which is so curious because it was not invented, when the Warner Brothers began using sound, which, of course, was not the beginning, but was a point where it became widespread. It wasn't about dialogue at all. It was about music, it was about sound effects, and really curious question to think, why did dialogue become so powerful? And I actually think that the issue about dialogue and sound is one about time. That actually, because I one of the strongest feelings, like if you watch The Jazz Singer, which of course is not a sound film, it's not a talkie film, it's a sound film, it's a part talkie. And there's an enormous difference in your sense of the temporality of that film between the scenes where it's sound effects and music, and those brief sequences where people talk, where suddenly space and time is very different. And which is partly the way people have talked about that is realism. But I think, again, realism is just a confining concept. It's something much more complicated. And I hope the person who asked this very, very important question is doing work on this, because I will admit, I don't think I'm the best person to do it, but I absolutely agree. It is very important, and that hopefully the usefulness of the idea of attraction is that it could be applied places where I haven't applied it. And I think sound would be one of the richest.
All right. So we have been, enjoying so rich kind of conversation about the different aspects that centers around, the cinema attraction and its multiple implications. But, Tom's time is approaching, 11 p.m. So, but we have to stop here so that he'll sleep, comfortably for this night. But, I was very, excited that our, curriculum, particularly for this session, like some of our previous events, provide you with a rich opportunity to rehearse the rich tradition of film theory that we are all concerned with, starting with, Sergei Eisenstein's, seminar, concept of the attraction in the theater, in the classical, film theory age, to André Bazin and Laurent Mulvey as the founding figure of the modern, film theory, and, reaching into, the implications of attraction in, the current debate about the impact of AI and the various kinds of, moving images that we encounter outside the traditional standardized movie theater. So that's the reason. That's one of the reasons that we have been opening, such kind of, avenue, by inviting, the established and, emerging scholars, concerned with cinema and media studies. And so I hope that this opportunity will be helpful to your further research, inquiry, or reflection on what cinema has been and what cinema will be. So thank you for your attendance, and most importantly, let us give a big hand to Tom, who gave a wonderful talk and engaged in wonderful discussion.
Thank you all.